Hello, BookTube. This is Aaron from Aaron Read a Book or Aaron Read a Book. I've just got a random video today. I was reading, I'm about halfway through, Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, and one of the main reasons why I read this book is because I remember reading a quote from Anthony Trollope once that said, he said something like that Dickens wasn't the best author of his generation or his age. It was William Makepeace Thackeray, and so this is kind of a book recommendation from one of my favourite authors. And the thing that's really struck me reading it is how much I can see Trollope has taken from it. If you've read Trollope, you know that he often talks to the author directly, and that is something that is done very well in Vanity Fair, and it has this sort of same humorous tone to it. He also has the odd funny name in here as well, that Trollope often did, but a lot of Victorian writers seem to do that. So I thought I'd go through some of my favourite authors and do a bit of research and see who their favourite authors was and see if I like them, and also like it's free book recommendations for me for my favourite authors. So I thought I'd go through some of my favourites and tell you who their favourite were based on interviews and things. It's harder the further you go back, because in modern times newspapers would often ask people who are your favourite authors, or The Guardian has an ongoing books of your life sort of thing where they interview famous people, quite often authors, and ask them like what their first book was and things like that, and what they're reading now and things. But we'll start with Trollope, who is my favourite Victorian writer, and I'd say Victorians are my favourite period of writing. So so his favourite writer was William Makepeace Thackeray, and he actually wrote a book on Thackeray called Thackeray, which is available for free on Kindle, so you can download that if you're interested. So he didn't. So it's very helpful. These older ones, like I say, are harder. Another one would be like Elizabeth Gaskell wrote a biography of Charlotte Bronte, who was her friend and contemporary. So that one's another easy one. An interesting thing I found from that book is that Thackeray, Trollope thought that not Vanity Fair was not his masterpiece. It was Henry Esmond and the Virginians, which I've never even heard of. So it's interesting that he thought that. And here's a quote from the book: "I do not hesitate to name Thackeray the first. His knowledge of human nature was supreme, and his characters stand out as human beings with a force and truth which has not, I think, been within the reach of any other English novelist in any period." So he thinks he's the best. I do also personally, I haven't seen this pop up, but I do think Trollope must have read Jane Austen as well, just from the stylistic point of view. And there's an ongoing theme, there'll be an ongoing theme in this video of Jane Austen popping up, and I think that A, says a lot about Jane Austen, and B, it kind of reminds me of, with music, almost all of my favourite bands are influenced by the Beatles. So maybe I just everything in my life stems from Jane Austen and the Beatles. Next we're going to go to an author who only died recently, so it's easier to get more sources on her, and that's Ursula K Le Guin, who is my favourite science fiction writer, and again, science fiction is one of my favourite genres. She's also my second favourite fantasy writer, after Tolkien, who she acknowledges as an influence as anyone who wrote fantasy, well, even now, but especially in the 60s and 70s would have done. So there's an interview with Le Guin in Entertainment Weekly, where they asked her what books have you read over and over again, and she said dozens, from Alice in Wonderland to Black Beauty, from The Jungle Book to Kim, from Pride and Prejudice to Jane Eyre to Little Dorrit to The Lighthouse. So again, we have our friend Jane Austen, and Virginia Woolf. So there she's named, she also said, and poets Shelley, Keats, A.E. Housman, T.S. Eliot, William Jeffers. So there's not a lot of science fiction there. Well, there's no science fiction there. So that maybe explains her more literary style than perhaps some other science fiction fantasy writers. Do I take her recommendation seriously? I've not read Alice in Wonderland or Black Beauty. I loved The Jungle Book. I haven't read Kim. Pride and Prejudice I obviously love. Jane Eyre I love. Not a fan of Dickens really. I do own Little Dorrit though, so I'm glad she's called out that one so I can read that one. To the Lighthouse, I have read this. I can't believe that she reads this over and over again because I found it hard going. I think I've gotten better with Virginia Woolf's non-fiction than fiction. I've read some of her essays and things. I struggle with all sort of modernist stuff like stream of consciousness. So I did try and read. I did read this when I was about 14 though. So maybe I'm grown up enough now to read it. She also had an interview with the New Yorker where where they asked her, "You once said you often read a book more than once, sometimes many times, but that only with works by Dickens, Tolstoy, and Tolkien have you lost count. Are there any other writers who have since joined that list?" And she said, "Oh yes, Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf, Kipling's Kim and the Jungle Books, Islandia. I don't know, is that Keats? Yeats, A. Housman. I'm sure there are many others. The lovely thing about being a very fast, very careless reader is that you can read long books and then in a few years you can read them again, and if they're good, they only get better and more amazing every time. That's not a bad test for the quality of a book, rereadability, but it's no guarantee of the quality of the reader, which is typical sort of Le Guin jokey insightful comments. I am not a very fast reader. I'd say I'm about average, but I am a very careless reader, like she is, like she says. So I do forget things. So I am a fan of rereading for that reason. I can forget things and then enjoy them again a few years later. But yeah, the poetry is probably the stuff I'm least familiar with that she's mentioned. So maybe I'll have to check out later. I'm rubbish at poetry. Next, we're going to go to another person who often pops up, like Jane Austen, in the favourite authors of my favourite authors, is P.G. Wodehouse. Basically, any English person who has written even slightly funny book seems to love P.G. Wodehouse, and it is because he is the funniest. I think this is the author that I looked up that I had by far the least sources that I could find him saying things about other authors. But in Wikipedia, it says that as a young man, he enjoyed the literary works of Arthur Conan Doyle and Jerome K. Jerome, and the operatic works of Gilbert and Sullivan. Wodehouse quotes from and alludes to numerous poets throughout his work. The scholar Clark Olney lists those quoted, including Milton, Byron, Longfellow, Coleridge, Swinburne, Tennyson, Wordsworth, and Shakespeare. Another favoured source was the King James Bible. And in the Jeeves and Wooster series, there were quotes, or there were parts where Jeeves, I imagine it's Jeeves and not Bertie, because I think Jeeves reads the works of Spinoza, Shakespeare, and Dostoevsky, which kind of suggests that Wodehouse liked them. Again, big poetry influence. Jerome K. Jerome doesn't surprise me, and he's going to pop up again in other authors that I mention. I have read Three Men in a Boat, but I've never read anything else by him. I really loved that, so I should check out more. And obviously I'm a big Arthur Conan Doyle fan. But yeah, it doesn't surprise me that Jerome K. Jerome is an influence on P.G. Wodehouse, because he has the same. He was a Victorian writer, but he had the same kind of sense of humour. Next, we'll go on to another humorous English writer who I love, and that is Terry Pratchett. I think from his works that it's very obvious that Terry Pratchett is a huge fan of Shakespeare, and I always think that is the biggest influence on his writing. But there are some others that he mentioned in his life. He's one who died fairly recently, so we have lots of quotes and things from him. First, I'm going to mention some people on Reddit who are. Reddit's obviously not the most reliable source because it's just people talking, but someone did say on there that they heard him speak on the Good Omens tour, and his immediate answer when they asked who his favourite writer was P.G. Wodehouse. So that's not surprising that he has the humour of P.G. Wodehouse. Another person said that in Finland, when he was in Finland, he was interviewed by a Finnish magazine, and he said that Toby Jansen was a big influence, so the Moomin people, and that kind of makes sense because he has like cartoony characters. And he also mentioned an author I've never heard of called another Redditor said that he recommended Carl Heisen. I'll write the name, and he did like satirical crime books, so that sounds interesting. I'll need to check those out. But he was interviewed by The Observer, and here's what he said. What about your influences on your work? Terry Pratchett says, it's really so hard. I think all of us in my curious corner of the profession probably have to admit to an influence from Jerome K. Jerome. If you weren't influenced by him, you were influenced by people who were influenced by him, because he was the master of that tone of voice. Wodehouse is influenced by him, and Mark Twain had a very similar tone of voice, but with the American twist on it. I used to buy bound copies of Punch for £0.50 from my local second-hand bookshop. I'd just read the whole thing like a buzzsaw, and it rubs off on you after a while. So yeah, Jerome K. Jerome, again, P.G. Wodehouse makes sense. I like P.G. Wodehouse because Terry Pratchett was the first author that I kind of fell in love with. And they also asked him who are the writers you most admire, and he said the writer who I was first acutely aware of as a physical personality was G.K. Chesterton, and that was because he lived in Beaconsfield, where I was born. My grandmother remembered him. I must say, she remembered him in terms of big man with squeaky voice. My grandmother, God bless her, was a bit like the Count of Monte Cristo. She had this 4-foot shelf in her flat which contained all of her books that you ever needed to read. There were a couple of Chestertons, Conan Doyle's complete short stories, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, key volumes she'd picked up over the years, and I had read my way through her shelves. So that's interesting. Again, he mentioned P.G. Wodehouse, but he also mentioned G.K. Chesterton, who is a writer I often see referenced, and I think I'm definitely going to like that writer because everyone I like seems to like him. But I've bought 2 books of his, and I've not read any of them yet. I've got The Innocence of Father Brown, which is some of the Father Brown short stories, and they're like a detective who's like a priest, I believe. So he's mentioned G.K. Chesterton, who's a detective, and also Conan Doyle, who's popped up a couple of times. Popped up for P.G. Wodehouse as well. It's kind of not surprising that an English author would be influenced by Conan Doyle, because he's just brilliant, and everyone knows Sherlock Holmes. But it's interesting that Pratchett has these 2 people who did sort of, and he, again, that Carl Heisen guy, also mysteries. So it's interesting that that kind of doesn't transfer into his book that much, though he has like the City Watch books and stuff where they investigate crimes and things. But yeah, the other one I have is the man who would be the man called Thursday or the man called Tuesday or something like that. I don't know. I couldn't find it anywhere, but I've got that somewhere as well. I know I've seen people on Reddit, on BookTube talk about G.K. Chesterton, and I've read him, and it does. I just feel like I probably will like him, so I just should read them. And yeah, so Terry Pratchett sounds like I would probably like his influences. I've never read Toby Yanson as well. I'd like to try that. Try one of those. And finally, I'm going to go one more author, and their influences is one of my favourite authors, Elizabeth Jane Howard. And she was married to an author, so she was married to Kingsley Amis, and her son-in-law was Martin Amis, so they'd probably all influenced each other in some way. So I knew about that, but I didn't know much about her other influences, and she gives some interviews, and this is who she mentioned. Her favourite The Guardian says her favourite author is Jane Austen, whose heroines face similar dilemmas. In fact, it was Howard who first introduced a teenage Martin Amis to the delights of reading when she gave him a copy of Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth Jane Howard says, turned out bloody well, really. What I was so pleased about was that he really appreciated her like a grown-up person. So again, like I said, all my favourites seem to be influenced by Austen. And I do see that in her writing, because she has the heroines. She focused mainly on, in this series. She focused mainly on three women. And she did another interview with The Independent, and they said choose your favourite author and say why you like him. And she mentioned an author that I've been very curious about. I see Charlie Heathcote mention her a lot. And she said Elizabeth Taylor. It's very often said that writers are in the straight tradition of Austen, but of her it's true. She is very enchanting, very funny and very sharp. She paints a small canvas perfectly. I find myself coming back to reread her, and that's the true acid test of a good author. So another call out there for rereading. But yeah, I've never read Elizabeth Taylor, but I think I've bought one recently on Kindle. But yeah, she seems like the kind of writer that I would like. She's the right kind of era. I think sort of early 20th century, and I just tend to like women writers from that period. But yeah, not read her, so I'd be interested to see if anyone is a fan. Comment down below, because obviously I love Elizabeth Jane Howard. Another interview in The Guardian. This is just an excerpt from an article in The Guardian. It says, in 1953, when she was working as a part-time editor at Chatto and Windus, Elizabeth Jane Howard came across a proof copy of A Rose for Winter by Laurie Lee and was transfixed. She said he could write about anything, a sunrise, a city, in a manner that was both fresh and familiar. She writes in her 2002 memoir, Slipstream, his language flowed as naturally as a spring of water whose depths are never obscured by muddy uncertainty. So that's an interesting connection that I would have not made, but I've only read Laurie Lee's book As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning, which is Deb from Rainer Rees reviewed this on Sunday, actually. It is a book about when he was like an 18-year-old and he walked from Putney, I believe, to Spain, to the bottom of Spain. It's a really interesting book, and he does have a really nice writing style. And I've got his book Sides for Rosie as well, which I haven't read yet, but I hear mixed things about. But I would never have made that connection between Laurie Lee and Elizabeth Jane Howard. And finally, another interview she had on a website called Bookanista, which I don't know. They said she tells me she loves Hinton mystery and that I must read all of his novels. And this made me happy to see, because I'm reading I'm going to read the first Elizabeth Jane Howard Caslett Chronicle in a couple of months, and I'm doing a read with Sarah from Your True Shelf and Joe Smith, who's a commenter on BookTube and a very frequent body reader with lots of people. And I know she's a big fan of Hinton mystery, so hopefully that's a good sign that Joe might like Elizabeth Jane Howard. But I've not read this, so I do need to read this as well. I think I'm going to read it later this year at some point, because there's definitely a read along. I think it's is it Gemma and Charlie's read along? Is it the FOMO Book Club? I think the FOMO Book Club are reading it. Yeah, so I'm going to try and read it the same month as they read it anyway. If it's them, or it's one of the book clubs. It's definitely one with Gemma and Charlie in it. And Jack, I think. Yeah, so hopefully we'll get around to that at some point, and hopefully that's a good sign. I always see Elizabeth Jane Howard in Rosamund Pilcher as well, and I'm pretty sure Rosamund Pilcher was influenced by Elizabeth Jane Howard. So if you're a Rosamund Pilcher fan, give Elizabeth Jane Howard a try as well. But yeah, that's a very kind of rambly video about some of my favourite authors and their influences, and I think it has given me some things to look into, some authors to check out. I'd be interested to hear if anyone else does this. I have to say, now that ChatGPT can go on to the internet, it's a lot easier to do research for this sort of thing, because you can just tell it to look for quotes from interviews and things, and it will do it for you. So you definitely don't use ChatGPT to write a book or something, but it does help you find quotes and things. So as long as it's using real sources, you can be happy that it's sort of semi-accurate. But yeah, that's a little video on influences. Let me know of any ones that you know about. Is there any sort of famous fanboy relationships or fangirling relationships in literature that you know about? Gaskell's the other one that I know very well. I would be interested to see someone do, and I'm sure they already have done, but videos on Jane Austen's influences, because Jane Austen influenced everyone basically on this list, and I think her influence is a bit more obscure, but I don't feel qualified enough to include her in this, because I think it would require more research. But I also know Fanny Burney was one of her influences, so I need to check out some Fanny Burney at some point. But yeah, have a good one, BookTube. Bye.